Welcome back to the program. Joining me now is Peter McGauran, former minister in the Howard government, now senior advisor at Bondi Partners, and Simon Banks, former Labor advisor, now managing director at Hawker Britain. Peter, first to you, this really concerning situation in Alice Springs, the lapsing of the Stronger Futures legislation last year and those mandatory bans in Indigenous communities on alcohol is having a devastating impact by the sounds, according to Mariam Scrimgeour, the Labor member for Lingiari. In fact, Peter, today she's saying that we can't be talking about the voice when there's such a stark need for intervention in the top end. What's your read on this latest example of Indigenous disadvantage?
It's heartbreaking. It's widespread. Even in some of our capital cities, Perth not least of all, and Darwin, we have this issue of law and order, and it's born out of poor housing, poor literacy, inadequate employment opportunity, health issues, drugs, alcohol, and so on. So I think Mariam Scrimgeour's statement will resonate with a lot of people. We have to address these issues. We've tried. I was in Parliament for 25 years, and the biggest abject failure of my contribution, and I think most MPs would say the same thing, has been turning the tide, notwithstanding improvements on the disadvantage of Indigenous people. So symbolism is important, consultation is critical, but so are these hard, difficult issues to solve on the ground.
It's really, and it comes at a time, a very sensitive time in a political sense for the Albanese government trying to build support for the voice to Parliament. But Mariam Scrimgeour says she absolutely supports the voice, Simon Banks, but I think we can't have these conversations if there's all these issues that are impacting on communities like Alice Springs.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's just basic functional elements obviously occurring with Alice Springs with the degree of violence that's going on. I mean, it's completely unacceptable. I don't know anyone who would say otherwise. But I think the contribution that Peter then just made was really important, is that we've been grappling with these issues for a very long period of time. There may well be, in fact, there almost certainly must be some short-term measures that we need to take to ensure people are just safe inside Alice Springs. But we need to work on collective long-term solutions to these problems. This type of violence, is all too frequent. I mean, just to give you an example, we saw some violence in the lead up to the federal election in Wadeye, a bit further north, obviously, in the Northern Territory. Another and a different set of factors driving that violence within that community, but almost 5% of the Wadeye community had to actually leave it because of the level of violence that was going on. So we can't pretend that these problems are one-off within Indigenous communities. We can't pretend that there is always one simple solution or cause to these problems either. These are long-term structural problems that we've got to address, but actually working with Indigenous people, listening to them, drawing on their wisdom about how we solve these problems is a critical part of finding longer-term solutions.
Peter McGauran, I spoke to Dr. John Boffa earlier. He's a GP from Alice Springs. He's also the spokesperson for the People's Alcohol Action Coalition in Alice Springs. And he pointed out that with the young ones roaming the streets and getting into a lot of trouble in Alice Springs, that in many cases they're safer on the streets than going home in the wake of those alcohol bans being lifted because of the abuse that they are seeing in many communities. It is a horrific situation, Peter.
Correct, and this will inevitably feed into the debate around the voice. And when you've got just Senator Jacinta Price, who comes from Alice Springs, and Mariam's calls and the mayor and small business operators for intervention to stabilise the situation, then you know that talk of consultation and the like, that's the consultation you need. So look, I'm not opposed to the voice. My disposition is to support it. We don't yet have enough detail, but I understand the Prime Minister's argument. This is a constitutional amendment wholly and solely to establish it via the Parliament, and then it becomes a democratic vote. But nonetheless, he's losing control of this. issue and debate, and it will get too clouded, it will get too partisan and polarising. And I do think that the Prime Minister's got to step into Alice Springs, otherwise his wider agenda for the voice will be affected.
Simon, it's a fair point from Peter, isn't it? That the very real and short-term response to this immediate crisis does have an impact on that broader debate. There's no doubt about it, particularly at the time when Peter Dutton and others are arguing that we need to fix the real life situation for our first Australians.
Yes, we do, but I mean the reality is that this event didn't just occur in the last couple of months. As I said, there have been violence across Indigenous communities going back decades that we still haven't been able to resolve. So yes, there will need to be some short-term action to try and curtail the violence. There are some related causes, for example, that a number of Indigenous communities are effectively in Alice Springs at the moment because of flooding in other parts of Northern Territory and Western Australia who wouldn't normally be there. That's contributing to some of the problems as well. There are clearly resources where the Northern Territory government, I mean, they've got the first and primary responsibility to provide the safety for their citizens. I don't think we should forget that. But we do have a federal government that's shown since it was elected that it's prepared to step in and provide assistance and help where it needs to in local communities. I think it is needed in the Alice Springs. I hope the Northern Territory government will seriously consider the assistance that it needs to help bring this situation under control. But we need to start working almost straight away then on the longer term solution to these problems. Otherwise, this is just going to happen again and again and again.
Sadly, it's even being described as the equivalent of a natural disaster, the flow-on effect of lifting those alcohol bans, Peter McGauran. So Bridget McKenzie on the program earlier saying that the Prime Minister needs to deal with this with the same sort of urgency as he would a disaster.
Yes, and we still don't have an explanation why the government did lift the controls on alcohol sale and distribution. I haven't seen a proper explanation yet. So who was consulted then? But action's needed, and we're all expecting it. Otherwise, the whole debate about the voice being the consultative body will get conflated with the government not doing enough on the practical, especially law and order issues that all Australians unhesitatingly want assisted in Indigenous communities.